So, hey, folks, this is Bob Ferguson, and today I have my friend Mike Owen with me. Mike favored us with a visit to Fairfield at our hands-off meeting, and he had some absolutely compelling information about tax policy. So, Mike coordinates fiscal policy work with other issue priorities at Common Good, Iowa, engaging staff and partners to advance policy ideas that equitably and sustainably address the concerns of all Iowans. He is part of the communications team developing messages and strategies to better reach policymakers, advocates, and the public, and assist the executive director in outreach and fund development. Mike, we really appreciate the work you're doing. And we decided that we would focus this discussion on tax policy, though we may range to other issues, because that's on people's mind. So, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 on the table now, some provisions set to expire, it's really an important time to set back and look at what impact does tax policy have? What is good tax policy? How do you make sure that everyone's needs are met? So that's why I brought you here, Mike, because you got the goods on that. So let's start with that. Help us out with some background information, and then let's get into the weeds.
Okay, well, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, as you noted, much of it is expiring this year. It was set to do that when originally passed. So the effort now is to shape what happens next. There are proponents of those tax cuts, which heavily favored the wealthiest people in the country, that want to see them continue, and in fact, would make them even bigger in future years. There are others who would like to simply see them expire, and then there's also some middle ground where people would like to see the provisions that help middle and lower income people stay intact. So that's the basic fight right now. Now, with a House and Senate controlled by one party, the president's party, the drive is to go for the heavier tax cuts. Actually, much of the debate among the Republican Party right now in Washington is how far are we going to go? So that's kind of the starting place here. Now, there are some rather arcane rules that Congress has to follow in passing tax law, especially because of the Senate's requirement for 60 votes. So they do things in what's called reconciliation. The long and the short is that people who really want big tax cuts and big cuts in services are debating with people who want maybe a little bit less than that among the Republicans. That's where the power in this debate lies right now. Except for, as you mentioned, the meeting in Fairfield, one of many around the state and around the country, the hands-off meetings and similar town halls that are occurring. There rests much power in people to show what they want and to make members of Congress, House and Senate, recognize the risks of some of these choices that they otherwise might make. People don't want to see tax cuts for the wealthy at the expense of low and moderate income people who need Medicaid, who need nutrition benefits such as SNAP, middle income people who need help with student loan. All of these things are in jeopardy with the kinds of service cuts that will have to happen to make the big tax cuts.
Question on that, stepping back from that, I think many people feel that, okay, we should cut taxes, which will stimulate growth, stimulate business activity. And I realize that a full discussion of that is far beyond the scope of this conversation. On the other hand, we were talking before we started recording about balancing the needs of the bottom half or even the bottom, three quarters of the population versus the needs of the top quartile and the needs for business to have as free a hand as possible. So I think a lot of people are either confused about this or have latched on to one part of an understanding. And I'd like to have a little bit deeper dive into what makes the most functional tax policy when you're looking at economic vitality and taking care of people so that people get their basic needs met?
Well, there is a time honored quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a Supreme Court justice, and it's over a century old quote that taxes are what we pay for civilized society. And it's a good place to start most tax discussions to remind people that, we don't just have taxes in a vacuum. Taxes are the way we pay for things that we need, that we see that our communities need, that we see that our neighbors need. They pay for public services that otherwise would not be provided or not be provided efficiently by the private sector. It's the way that we have everything from our national defense to local police and fire departments. It's how we set up our education system so that we have universal access to good public education, which fosters a well informed citizenry that helps us not only govern, but also helps businesses in every industry across our economy. All of these things work together. And part of that also is assuring that we have a strong, people call it a safety net, but supports for people who are at low incomes through no fault of their own, people who have disabilities, who need assistance. It's how we have healthcare and nutrition programs. These are the things that are at stake. So when we talk about taxes, we're talking about much more than that.
Right.
We're talking about all of those kinds of services that are funded by taxes. And we never should miss the opportunity to remind people of that because it doesn't often get into the discussion. Right now in Iowa, for example, big issues about further tax cuts in our state. So we've already had a bunch of state income tax cuts. We may have more coming down the line. We have proposals to restrict other opportunities to meet our needs through taxes. We also are having right now a big discussion about property taxes. But what's missing in all those discussions is the impact on services. Common Good Iowa, one of the things that we have suggested is that we should never have a discussion about tax policy without identifying the services connection. So whether you're talking about raising taxes or about cutting taxes, what are the implications for services? If you're going to raise taxes, why are you doing it? Are you doing it just to keep up with costs? Are you doing it because you want to enhance services that we have? Or are there some services that we should be thinking about that we're not doing right now? I think a lot of people, there would be a lot of opinions on that. But when it gets reduced into a question of how much are we going to pay, as opposed to what are we going to pay for, it's not an honest discussion. And the same goes for the question of tax cuts. We need to have that connection made. We're seeing the same thing play out at the national level, where with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we keep hearing these really big numbers, $4.5 trillion in tax cuts over 10 years, for example. Well, okay, what does that mean? Why are we going to do it? And how does it compare? I mean, when we find out that part of the package means that they will have to make big cuts. Specifically with that proposal, there's right now some budget frameworks that have been passed by the House and Senate, but they're still negotiating over what this is all going to look like. But the House, for example, assigned the committee that governs Medicaid to find $880 billion in cuts. And it assigned the committee that deals with SNAP to find $2.3 billion in cuts. And it assigned the committee that deals with student loans and education grants to find $330 billion in cuts. So those are the big issues, Medicaid and SNAP, for example, that there is no way to meet those kinds of budget targets. There is no way they can do that without hitting benefits that people are counting on for health and nutrition.
I think a question in people's mind is if we allow the wealthy to become even wealthier, somehow that will trickle down and they'll have more money to invest and that'll be a good thing. And I think that was a theory proposed in the Reagan years. It does seem to have not provided the benefits. In fact, it seems to have done one major thing, which is to concentrate wealth upwards in the last 40 years, dramatically so,
Yes.
so that you have a large percentage of the population which is no better off and many worse off. And then you have a tiny sliver of the population who is wildly better off. So let's talk about that because I think that's in a visceral emotional issue. People have strong feelings. But what does the data say about balancing tax revenues with services? And how do you even come to or start thinking about an optimal mix so that we have the best of all worlds, given that everything, you have to pay for everything, right?
That's a fair question. It's certainly a complex question that I can't sit here and say I have that answer. I am not an economist, by the way. I don't want to suggest otherwise, but I listen to lots of economists who uniformly discount the idea of trickle-down economics. It's never been shown to work. There was an interesting report that was recently done by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where they call this a triple threat. And I think this agenda of tax cuts and service cuts, but they looked at how this would work in 2026, for example, by income bracket, if you put these things together. As I said before, you can't disconnect the taxes from the services in general discussion about these. They actually tried to quantify it in terms of the impact on income at different levels. Because when you then have those tax cuts, people at the high end will get an increase, but people at even the bottom 80%, for example, would see a net decrease in their income, not just from not getting as big a tax cut, but because of services that they would lose. And of course, the lower you go on the income scale, the greater loss that you have. So you'll have politicians out there saying that everybody gets something from these tax cuts. The things that some people are getting are not on the positive side.
Right.
They actually will have a net loss. I mean, the bottom 20% would lose almost $2,300. People in that income bracket, $2,300 is a lot of money. That deals with their basic ability to provide for their families, whether it's in housing or health or clothing. I mean, you just can go on down the list, but you lose some of these supports and it's going to have an impact on their ability to provide lots of things. The lessons there are that it's a very risky thing at best. The evidence is pretty clear that this strategy has never worked to boost economies. I mean, the Trump tax cuts did not boost economic growth in this country. In fairness, we also had the COVID pandemic that came through. So you probably didn't have a good testing environment for that. But everything that, as you mentioned before, from the Reagan years, this has always been shown as something that builds deficits.
Not only do we have a pressure on the lower 80% or the bottom 80% of the population, but we also have massive ballooning deficits. And even if you cut essential services, which then there's a cost to that. Because if you cut essential services, then people don't have those services, but they need those services. So there is either a cost in social unrest, there's a cost, there's a compensatory cost that somehow needs to be made up. And then you have this massive ballooning deficit because of the people who I've talked to who are more favorable toward tax cuts and dramatic reductions in government say, well, okay, well, that's the only way we can do it. We're on an unsustainable path. What I read indicates that a relatively modest adjustment in taxes for the wealthiest folks, including Social Security taxes, raising the limit on that, some very practical things that would not, in my view, in any way disturb the lifestyle of people who are very well off, that we
Right.
can bring the whole system into much greater balance. And I think that's the thing that tends to frustrate my understanding is that What are we missing as a society? Why are we going down this road of reducing the government by cutting essential services? I'm all for the smallest government possible, but no smaller. How do we think about balancing all those needs?
Well, as you were talking, one of the things that occurred to me was examples of specific tax policies that we've seen in the past. And so, one of the long-standing debates is about the estate tax. The exemptions in the estate tax are so huge that in the upper 90% of people, 98% or more of people would not pay a state tax just because of the exemptions that exist. Nevertheless, people in that group get concerned about it. And
Opposite.
politicians wave that one around like, oh, we're going to reduce your estate tax. You're going to have to pay it to begin with. Your family was not going to have that at the time of your death to begin with. That's one of the issues, by the way, in the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, is that law doubled the exemptions that we had in the estate tax for wealthy people. That would be a good one to see expire because those folks really don't need the help. They're going to do just fine. But people got concerned about it. Now, another issue that's out there right now is people are concerned about their Social Security, which isn't really part of this debate necessarily, can be, but there are other things going on that cause people to be concerned about their Social Security right now. Think about how many people you've talked to over the last several years who have raised concerns that their Social Security might not be there, or that maybe they're still of working age in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and thinking, well, it's not going to be there. I mean, that has been a line that has been fed to them for several years that actually is designed to undermine Social Security, which would be just fine and could be fine with minor adjustments for decades, but that's not on the table. But think of the stress levels that has put on people, and
Yeah,
especially right now. Now, that's something you can't quantify on a CBO analysis or something,
right.
but that is something that enters into people's, that they're feeling that right here. They may be getting Social Security right now, wondering if they're going to have it in 3 months. We have to be better than that. That's part of our civic culture demands that. That's what we're supposed to be able to do in the United States, is depend on our systems that have been set up, our institutions, to be there when we need them. What the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act threats are the Trump tax cuts of the last Trump administration that they're trying to extend now. That is a real threat whether those institutions will survive. We have to remind ourselves what we really expect and think about it and not fall for the latest one-liner on a TV news show from a talking head.
Yeah, Senator Elizabeth Warren made a point that I think was misquoted widely. I think it was to the point that, if you're in business and you make a lot of money, good on you. You're
Mhm.
going to keep most of it. But if you try to keep all of it, then the money doesn't recycle, is my interpretation of what she said, doesn't recycle back into society. Plus, all of the institutions of society that businesses depend on and individuals who run businesses, the Coast Guard, the
Right.
interstate highway system, air traffic control, the military,
Mhm.
horrible things that we take for granted, plus the safety nets
Yes.
that their workers many times rely on. It's always struck me as exceptionally short-sighted.
One of the first words that would occur to me when we think about what kind of a society we want to live in, and this may not be everybody's first word, but I think a lot of people would share it, is opportunity. I think that we've always viewed our country as one where um, everybody has an opportunity to succeed, and that doesn't mean that um, we just hand them things, but we set the civic landscape in such a way, and the economic landscape in such a way that they have a chance to get by and then to do better. This policy that we're talking about now, this tax cut bill in Washington, is not furthering that at all. At the Fairfield meeting and at several meetings I've been to, one of the statistics we use is showing that 30% of the benefit of extending these tax cuts would go to the top 1%. Almost half of the benefits of extending these tax cuts would go to the top 5%. That means that about 50%, half of the benefit, goes to the bottom 95%. It also means a tremendous imbalance in the size of the benefit at various income levels. So you have somebody who's making well over $700,000 getting, I believe the figure's over $60,000 in a tax cut, whereas somebody who's making about $96,000, who would be considered generally a middle class person, somebody in that household would be getting $400 on average. Somebody in that area,
From 90,000 down
yeah, below. So that,
on average.
yes, on average in that group, up to 90 some $1,000. You get an average benefit of $400. It just doesn't take you too far. We have to do better in balancing the impacts of these tax cuts. And again, in the services, making sure that we can provide the services that have really made the country what we expect it to be. The challenge right now is getting people to understand that right now before it happens.
What
Because
happened?
once it happens, it'll be too late. With Doge, for example, basically raiding the federal agencies, decimating a lot of services that are important. It's going to be hard to rebuild those in any case, let alone in a short time. Because if, for example, you're somebody who worked in the Department of Education who lost their job, or somebody who worked in the Health and Human Services who lost their job, what incentive right now is there for you to want to go back? Even if they turned around and said, "Oh, you're rehired." Okay, well, how long am I going to be rehired for? And in the meantime, how many people are going to be losing services that I was providing in that job? These are not going to be easy corrections to make. And so we really need to keep that long view in mind, as well as our overarching values of opportunity and really a sense of community. Your community can be your neighborhood, it can be your town, your city, your state, county, the whole nation, however you want to define it. I like to think of community as much bigger than the 20 houses around me. I like to think of community really as our country. And there's nothing wrong with thinking about it even broader than that, because we're busy offending all of our neighbors who have been friendly neighbors in other countries. So
All these years, right? Yeah, it is pretty amazing. My brother was at the upper reaches of USAID in science and technology and innovation. And he made the point is that agencies like that are not like a car. You can stop a car and then you can get back in and turn it on. So
mhm.
that's not the way it works, with these agencies, as you pointed out. My final thought would be, what kind of a society do we want? Do we want a society where we're no longer measuring carbon inputs? We're no longer measuring the impact of climate change? We're, gutting agencies that are doing crucial work for the quality of our life. Again, all to enrich people who do not need further enrichment. And it just strikes me that I am confident that we as a society can wake up out of this. I'm going to maintain my confidence that we can. And so, any other final thoughts, Mike, before we close up?
Well, I would echo that last thought you just expressed. I have been impressed by not only by the numbers, but by the passion of people showing up at rallies all over the place. I've been impressed by the ones we've seen in Iowa, but if you look at some of them that are happening around the country, enormous throngs of people showing up to talk about these things and hear about these things, and they do care. And I have to think that the politicians are paying attention. It's probably one of the reasons why we're not seeing members of Congress showing up at several of the hearings in Iowa. And I'm not saying that to be sarcastic or cynical. When I say that, I'm thinking they don't know what they're missing. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that they came into these jobs with high ideals. I think if they went to some of these meetings and heard some of the stories, they would better understand the job they have in making sure that these folks are taken care of, that these folks have an opportunity to succeed in our society, because that is supposed to be what we're all about.
Absolutely. That was so evident in the meeting with Senator Grassley. And I give him all the credit in the world. I don't agree with a lot of his policies. I absolutely do not agree with many of the things that he's promoting. And yet he was able to stand in front of an oftentimes tense crowd.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, in the end, as long as we're able to, and I will continue to do that until my last breath, if we're able to express ourselves in an informed way, and that's one of the reasons I do these interviews, is I want to inform myself and I want to have conversations with highly informed people. And we don't have all the answers. But if we don't talk about things and if we don't talk about fundamental principles, then we can't have the conversations that can inform us and our community, and by extension, apply that kind of pressure and understanding to our politicians.
Yes.
Well, Mike, thank you very, very much. I don't think this will be our last conversation, but we got some great things talked about today, and I truly appreciate you being here with me.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Bob.